So yes, second time in a month, and that's also the first 2 times I'm here speaking. So thank you very much for the invitation. Mostly I'm proud over the interest of such a sort of boring topic as time, because myself and a few others have been working with time-related issues here in Sweden for, I think now maybe 20 years, and I think it's about 20 years, as you will see on some of the slides. And it has been difficult to even get someone or anyone listening. And this time I heard sort of like some friends that also managed to get here, like John, for example, and Karin. They told me like 1 hour after open up the ability to register for this event, oh, we're sold out. Like, how did that happen? Like, I had to drag people, bribe people with beer and barbecue and stuff. And then you start talking about time and people leave. So you lock the door, right? Okay. So I'm working at a small not-for-profit called Netnode. I'm just going to tell you a little bit who we are. We just sell wholesale services to ISPs, to CCTLDs mostly. We have internet connect points in 6 locations, 2 here in Stockholm, and then a few others in Sweden. We have DNS servers in like 55 locations all over the planet. We have NTP service today in 4 locations, will be expanded to 6. Here in Sweden, we have maybe, I guess, 30 TLDs as customers, like Germany, the largest, .se, Netherlands, yeah, a couple of them. We're also one of 12 organizations running a root name server, so run DNS. We're one of 3 outside the US. So our origin is at the KTH, because when I was working there at the KTH, when we started the internet here in Sweden and the Nordics, we had an internet connect point at the KTH. But it was decided, the KTH thought this was pretty boring. We don't want to do this. We don't want to have commercial traffic. So we launched a foundation. And at that point in time, I was still helping Tele2, that I helped until 2000 to get Tele2 up and running, because Televerket and Telia was not cooperating. They thought internet was something that would not be used, as you will also see a couple of other examples of. So, and the goal was to have increased robustness and security. So we created a foundation that had as a goal to provide services that the ISPs could not find money to offer themselves, but services that the ISPs really needed together. So the IX was moved to bunkers in the mountains. The structure is basically like this. We run a big switch, and we have then the ISPs connected to the switch. So we do basically the same kind of thing as all of you have at home with one of those things with small, that you plug in your Ethernet connectors. We run about 1 terabit per second over our IX today. It doubles every year. So this is what it looks like. Deep into the mountain. Cannot tell you where it is. This is basically what it looks like. There are buildings that are sort of not connected to the rock, that is self-sustainable. You can live there. It's actually kind of cool for those of you who like these kind of things. It is, though, very, very difficult to have wires going from the outside into these buildings. Different story. We have hardware in multiple places around the world. We have sort of been lucky to be able to. Our goal is to help various entities because there are sort of risks with where they are. Because of this, it's sort of sad that they have had issues, but we had equipment both in Vanuatu and in Kathmandu, and both of those were up and running basically all the time. So we feel that given what has happened the last 6 months, that our strategy of locating hardware has been successful. That said, we really hope that this is not a map where you will see natural disasters the next 3 years. But anyways, the DNS service we have an average about 100,000 queries a second going to our DNS servers. So that's what we are doing. We are 20 staff. So we think that we are sort of pretty efficient in what we're doing. Difficult thing is, for example, we had a hard drive and a motherboard that went poof down in Wellington in New Zealand. It's not very okay. Can we replace that? Not very easy. Anyways, today, that's what we are doing. So one of the things we are doing, part from the IX and part from DNS, is to distribute time. So why is this important? So I will try to explain to you a little bit of what the issue is. First of all, if you look at this picture, how many of you do think that there is something wrong here? Okay, so there are some people in the room that think that this can actually be a. By the way, this is not a fake. I took it with one camera. There's not a copy and paste here. No photoshopping. This is the main, or was in 2007, the main conference room for the Prime Minister in Sweden. I was working for the Swedish government in those times. So this was kind of embarrassing that in the middle of Rosenbad in yes, Theo, you know what room I'm talking about. So anyway, so this is what it looks like. And even though you don't know much about time, you do understand that all of these clocks cannot be correct, right, at the same time. So this is sort of the beginning of like, what is time? If you start to think about what do you need to get time, you need two things. The first thing you need is a pendulum that goes back and forth that just say tick, tick, tick. And that thing needs to be extremely accurate. So each tick is exactly the same length in time as the previous tick. That's pretty difficult to make sure that you have a tick that is very, very accurate. The next thing you need to do is to count the ticks. Okay? So you know that this is tick number 315, and then you have tick number 314, and then tick number 315. And when you count them, the other difficulty, apart from the tick itself, is that, for example, me and John, we need to agree on when we started counting. Otherwise, like if I say, oh, well, I think I have tick 320, and John says, no, I have tick 325. That doesn't really help, right? So we need a very precise tick and a counter, and we need to know how to count. This is one of the reasons, like all of you have seen on your microwave ovens, and of course, some people are as old as me in this room, maybe, and remember the old VCRs that were blinking 00, and you had to set them because you didn't really know where you were. So what you have to do, it could tick, but it didn't know where to start the counting. So you need both, okay? So when you look at time and clocks, you have to think about precision and accuracy. And when we are trying to provide a time source and tell people what time it is, we try to be very careful of doing both high precision and high accuracy. Because if you only have one of them, or maybe none, that is not very helpful. On the other hand, if you have high precision and low accuracy, which you see down here to the right, in that case, you can adjust your clock a little bit. So it ends up being both high precision and high accuracy. Okay? So the importance here is that you need to have a tick, and you need to have a counter, and you need to do it so you have both high precision and high accuracy. When you have all of these things, then you can start to present the time to others. You can have sort of arms on a clock. You can have digits on a Nixie tube that I showed. Or this is the machine with the recorded voice that you, in Sweden, called Fröken Ur. This is the old Fröken Ur until they started to use a computer. You had all the voices recorded on this thing that was rotated. Someone called in. These arms were moving, and it played the voice. Okay? If you go to Borås, they still have this up in their lab. You can also, beside this one, you also have the meter, and you have like, this is how long a meter is, like the meter, and a few other things that, like a kilo is still a kilo, okay? You cannot really do kilos otherwise than comparing with a block of platinum, actually. Or, well, it's a mix of platinum and a few other things, but anyways, it's kind of cool to see these sort of real things. So the problem here is, of course, both the tick and the counting. What is time? Well, all of us think that, well, in a year, the Earth rotates around the sun. That would be good if it was the case that the Earth actually did rotate exactly the same speed around the sun, or that the rotation of the Earth was exactly like 1 day. It's not, okay? Because you have so many other things that affects the rotation of the planets. But what we do have is that we have a common view that the time is based on the Earth rotation and the Earth rotation around the sun. And that is what we call universal time, or UT. So we have, because to complicate things, we have various versions of UT, where UT0 is the time that we calculate the average time that it takes for the Earth to rotate around the sun, divided by the number of days, divided by the number of seconds and day, etc. That's UT0. But we don't really use UT0. We use UT1 for sort of universal time. The difference between the various UTNs, where n is between 0 and I think 5 or something, is always less than 0.3 seconds. So it doesn't really matter much. But the biggest difference is between UT0 and UT1. And the difference between the two, Karin, if you did your homework, is that in UT1, you are taking UT0 and you compensate with the movement of the magnetic North Pole. So just because the Earth is sort of rotating a little bit, that's the difference between UT0 and UT1. And that's why I think that UT1 is the time source and counting that we use to say that this is what time is. This is a second, this is blah, blah, blah. So UT1 is what sort of everyone was using. Everything was fine. But of course, during the hundreds of years, we had to do all different kind of things. And up until actually in 1870 or something in Sweden, we didn't even have like one Swedish time. What made us agree on what time was in Sweden was when the train arrived. Because up until we had trains, we had different times in Stockholm and Gothenburg. But when you had wanted to use this timetable, that didn't really work. So when the trains connected the cities, we had to start to use one Swedish time. Okay, so when we started to use atomic clocks, because a second, just counting a second, the pendulum with the help of a pendulum didn't really work, so we had to use an atomic clock. The problem is that an atomic clock that use radioactive material, the problem is that radioactive material is actually dissolving or falling apart much, much more precisely than any pendulum or the Earth for that matter, which means that unfortunately TA1 that we decided this is the atomic clock, unfortunately is much more precise than UT1. Bad luck. Okay, so what do we do? If the map is different from reality, do we change reality or do we change the map? So what we decided to do is to have so on January 1, 1958, we said that the difference between TAI and UT1 was 0. So from 1958, the difference between these two timescales have increased. I will show you a little bit. So what was decided to, many of you have seen seen that people talk about GMT. And I'm a little bit irritated on software developers and others that still talk about GMT, because we actually stopped using GMT in 1972. Read my lips. Since 1972, there is nothing called GMT, okay? So what we decided to do in the world is to have something called UTC, Universal Time Coordinated. So what we did was that we took UT1 and we compare UT1 with TAI. And when the difference between UTC and UT1 is larger than 0.9 seconds, we add or remove a leap second. Okay? So what we try to do is that we make sure that UTC has sort of the same slope as TAI because the atomic time scale, but we make sure that UTC is not more than 1 second away from what the Earth believes the Earth tick by adding or removing a second. And this means for all of your developers that there are minutes which have 61 seconds. So if you're parsing time, you must be able to parse 60 as a second. and the same way be able to print it. So after 59, you get 60, and then you get 0, not 59, 0. It's a quite common sort of programming mistake. You can have 61 seconds in a minute. OK. So we have UTC. So, and then, of course, we invent satellites that we send up in space that tells us where we are, called GPS was the first one, then Baidu and GLONASS. It's a little bit tricky to go up to these satellites and sort of add the leap second and stuff. So they decided that GPS do not have leap seconds. On the other hand, it is the same, it moves the same speed as the other atomic clocks, and the difference is not so large, but at the moment, it's 19 seconds difference between UTC and GPS. So here you have the red is UT1. Here's the year, OK, or UT, doesn't matter, not so much difference. The horizontal line up there on the top is TA1, 0. So you see that UT1 goes slower and slower. So we need to add, you see this, well, it's actually very hard to see, add leap seconds. And then here we started to have the GPS without leap seconds. And here the Chinese GPS, Baidu, started, and they actually restarted. So they have 2 different times. And the last time we added a leap second was 2012. But we will add one now again in 30th of June. So this is what it looks like. You have TAI that started in 58, just goes straight with an atomic, the same length of every second. That's the topmost. And then you have the GPS, exactly the same slope. A second has the same length as TA1, but it started a little bit later, so it's 19 seconds off. And then we have the blue one. That is what the Earth tells us. This is what time it is. So what we do is that we use UTC, which is the red one, which tries to follow the blue, but has the same slope as TAI. And until June 30, you have less than 0.3 seconds there, less than 0.9 seconds, 19 seconds between them. And this one is now 35 seconds, will increase to 36 seconds on June 30. OK? And now you ask yourself why you have issues with your log files. So this is the difference between UT1 and UTC. The difference between UTC, which is the time we're using, and UT1, which is the time the Earth is telling us what it is. And the red one is the future. So this is where we are adjusting with 1 second. You see, we go down to 0.6, almost minus 0.7 seconds. We add a second, so we end up there at plus 0.3 again. And then we expect sort of the Earth to continue to go a little bit slower. So the red is the future, the green is past. So this is the last couple of leap seconds we added. 2012, on June 30, we added one. 28, 25. I will not speak specifically how Google is handling the leap second, but there's one of the organizations that have a little bit of issues with that. What Google is doing is that they actually taken the leap second, and they are, instead of adding 1 second at the exact time when it's supposed to be added, they are smoothing out the addition of a second over 24 hours on all their servers in a synchronized way. So during 24 hours, the Google clock is different from sort of the other clock. And maybe you can tell me more about that, Arthur, but there's approximately that, right?
I read recently an article in Q, it's one of the website of the ACM, telling about this story. Very interesting.
Yeah. But the importance, which I will come back to now, sort of in the second part of the talk, is that for Google, it's extremely important that all the clocks on all computers goes exactly the same. That's the important thing. So why is it important to know what time it is? OK. Let's say that Car and myself have a date. And we go to my favorite restaurant, Brasserie Godot, here in Stockholm. To be able to have a successful date, we need to agree on 4 dimensions. Okay, height over the ground, not so hard. But then X and Y coordinates, so we know where to meet. But we also need to agree on when to meet. And the question there is, of course, how accurate must our clocks be? And by experience, long life experience, when meeting someone to have a beer, except John that is so patient, the clocks need to be, I claim, the same within about 15 minutes. Because that is about the time it takes to drink a beer. Because if Karen arrives early, have a beer, after 50 minutes, she might leave. So as long as I sort of a plus minus 15 minutes, okay. So just for having a beer, 15 minutes accuracy is okay. But we have other kind of transactions. And the real problem here, if you go back to sort of why this is important, is that we have multiple events that happens independent of each other, and they are then to merge. Timestamps of these events are merging, and we need to know which one of these events, we want to know in what order these events occurred. So the higher number of events per time unit we have, the more precise and more accurate our timestamps needs to be for the events themselves. You with me with that? So if we look at things really seriously, we look at the legislation. And one of the oldest laws we have in Sweden is from 1736. Say that if it is the case, and this is the first chapter about trade, if it is the case that you sell the same thing twice, whoever you sold it to first keeps the item, and then you have to pay a penalty. That means that already in 1736, you had to be able to prove when you had a dispute who you sold something to first, or vice versa. You, being the buyer, need to be able to explain that you actually, or prove that you actually bought it before your competitor. And this is, as I said, one of the oldest legislations we have in Sweden. You also have new legislation from the Euro SOX on information lifecycle management that require that you take backup, disaster recovery, restore, restart, archiving, long-term retention, data replication, day-to-day processes, blah, 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 with like all buzzwords you can find regarding retention. And of course, no one really knows what that means in reality, but it basically means that you need to be able to restore whatever you're doing and explain what you had done to be able to replay it if needed. So you actually have, if you look around, you have a higher and higher number of sort of legislation requirements that you need to know when things happened. We also have a couple of incidents in Sweden. And sometimes, of course, a second precision is close enough. But there have been a couple of incidents which have been kind of interesting that I've been following just the last 10 years. Or 15 years, sorry. Time flies. Last 15 years. For example, it was one procurement process, public procurement process, that was stopped 7 minutes early because the computer system that was receiving the electronic responses, the clock was 7 minutes wrong, so it closed the actual procurement process. So some bidders were not able to actually bid, and they didn't really know how to restart that, because just like in the fax in the case with the fax, it was not really stated in the actual procurement process what time scale was in use. For the fax, it was a response to an RFP, and a response to an RFP was rejected. And the proof for the rejection was that the timestamp from the receiving fax, and we all know how precise that is, right? The timestamp on the receiving fax was after midnight. The ones sending in the fax had a timestamp from Telia, the incumbent. This is the time when the phone call was made. That was before midnight. That went to the highest court in Sweden, and they turned the case down and said, we cannot judge here. because because Telia could not show that their clock was correct, and the one having the fax could not prove that their clock was correct or wrong. So they said, we cannot judge here, and you were not precise enough. Really messy. The Swedish foreign minister, Anna Lindh, was stabbed to death at the department store in Sweden. And the police had to work for 3 days to understand how the murderer, how the killer were walking inside the department store. The reason for that was that the cashier machines and the video cameras didn't have their time synchronized. So they had all of these people. I saw the killer, and here's the receipt. And then, but wait a second, how do you know that the timestamps were wrong? So they didn't really know in what order, and the video cameras were just all over the place regarding time. What saved the police a lot of work was that the credit card machines were synchronized with one credit card company. So the slips from the credit card machines had the same timestamp. The time was still wrong, okay? But at least you could compare the credit card slips with each other. And at the same cashier machine, you could use the credit card slip, compare it with the cashier machine, and that way know exactly what error of time it was of that cashier machine, and calculate backwards all the other cashier sort of receipts from that machine, yada, yada, yada. 3 days. I live in Skåne and travel back and forth like all the time. Like this morning, and one of the friends I have that travel even more than me, he travels every day back and forth. One of the senior executives of the Swedish police. So I brought up this case, and he said, yep, that was a real mess. So I actually confirmed this this morning again, that one of the biggest problems the police in the forensics have is that people that hand in log files or things with timestamps, if people only could say at the same time what error the timestamp is, that would help the police a lot. And I will come back to that. The last example, you know that here in Stockholm and also Gothenburg, you pay a fee when you drive a car in certain areas, okay? The fee is actually a tax. And the size of that tax, the amount you pay, depends on what time of day it is. Okay? So if you happen to drive by very close to one of these sort of time things, why don't you complain? Small hint. Well, actually, there were a couple of cases where people did complain, and they found out that, oh, wait a second, we actually have no idea what the time it is. So there were a couple of quite famous cases where people simply got their money back because they could not say on what time. They knew that they could not prove in court on what side of the time. Nowadays, I think first of all, they do keep track of the time and the error. Secondly, they are nice to people, so so when you have to pay, they are really sure that they can defend in court that they ask you to pay whatever you have to pay. But this was one of those kind of things that oh, wait a second, they didn't really think of it. Anyways, time is important. And then we have another thing, all of you that use GPS receivers to receive timestamps. The GPS actually receives two things. First of all, it's an incredibly good tick. And we use that. We use the tick from the GPS for our clocks. But we don't use the time that the GPS tells us. Because, for example, between Stockholm and Malmö, by looking at the same satellite, I forgot to make a picture of this. If you have Malmö there, Stockholm here, and then you have a satellite dish like this, you send the tick at the same time from there and there, and then you know the Earth's curvature. Just because you know exactly where the satellite is, and you know exactly where these are, and I mean within centimeters, you can actually calculate. You have your own tick here, and your own tick here, and then you can calculate how long time does this take, and how long time does this take. Okay, so what you can do is that you can say that given that the time in Stockholm is correct, you can say that this is sort of this is, let's say, alpha, and this is alpha prim. So what you can do is that you can know that in Stockholm, you are this much, your tick is this much ahead of the tick from the satellite. And then you can calculate, given that this is correct, what's the difference between the tick in Malmö and the tick from the satellite? Because you can calculate the difference between the delta t and delta t prime. But that is just because you always know where the satellite is and where these guys are. And this is kind of interesting, actually. A satellite just floating around there, blah, blah, blah. But the whole idea with GPS is that you do know where the satellite is. Otherwise, it would be kind of sort of useless. So that is that is called a common view. Oh, like I told a few people, like, okay, are you nervous about this talk? No, I'm not nervous about this talk, but this is the first time I have this presentation, so this will be interesting to know whether I actually talk about everything that I want to talk about. This was a slide I forgot, so sorry about that. So anyway, so with the help of common view, it is possible to get the time, the tick, very precise, because moving time is quite difficult. But unfortunately, it is quite common and popular, unfortunately, to have jammers for radio. And just because, like, there are so many sort of cars and outboard engines for boats that have sort of SMS senders and GPS receivers on them. So almost everyone that steals those kind of things have jammers. Jammers are illegal to own and to buy in every country within Schengen except the UK. It is only illegal to use jammers in UK, but you can buy them there. And this is one of the problems that, of course, you can then go to UK, you buy a jammer, you move it to Sweden, and then you use it wherever you want. And regardless of how much the police is trying to find the jammers, which is not so hard, because suddenly the radio sort of reception goes away, it is pretty difficult to get jammers go away. So a quite common attack vector against cell phones, GPS, and everything is to use jammers. We also have more and more sun issues, which means that we don't believe that for Swedish time, we can no longer be dependent on GPS because it's so easy to disturb the signal. There have also been a couple of attacks where the actual GPS signal has been replayed even though it's encrypted. It have replay on the GPS signal to be able to steer ships and other things out of course. That is more and more popular. Not fun at all, let me tell you. It's also the case that more and more companies in Sweden, organizations, do take their time from GPS, which is not wrong because the time from GPS is it's good enough. But we need to, in Sweden, have at least one time source that is not based on GPS that companies can compare their own clock with. And if the difference is too large, they can sort of issue an alarm or like notify, oops, something is probably wrong here. So I'm not saying don't use GPS, but please look at something else as well, so you detect if something is going bad. So the increased dependency of satellites is not a really good thing, and at the same time, time distribution is important. And this is what we have been trying to do with Netnode since around 2003, and then with the murder of the Swedish foreign minister, that's when everything just took off, and I've been working with this since. So more examples, data retention directive and more legislation. It actually says traceable time or spårbar tid. So if it is the case that you see legislation rules that talk about spårbar tid in Swedish or traceable time, that requires you not only to have a timestamp and a counter, you must know what the error is between your time and some other time scale. For example, the Swedish time. Okay? So that is the difference. So in some legislation, it only says time. Doesn't really matter. But if it says spårbar tid, that is by law, you must keep track of the error. And that is something that we sort of worked out with the Minister of Energy, Enterprise and Communications the last 10 years. We also need to make sure that we can handle time when networks are under stress. It's also the case that, for example, cell phone networks absolutely require good time and frequency. Otherwise, you cannot switch from one cell to another one. if the frequency is not the same, because then the call would drop. And you, of course, have more and more robot-driven stock markets and other things. It's not only people clicking on Tradera, you actually have robots doing these kind of things, and you need to make sure in what order. We need to know in what order transactions has taken place. So the financial sector is also talking with us quite a lot. So here's the story. If you go back a little bit more in time, I'm not talking about 25 years ago, around 1990. At that time, when you talked to Televerket, that was responsible for time, that then turned into Telia. First of all, they didn't want to start internet. That's why we started Tele2 or SwipNet. It was also the case that they charged the order of $100,000 a year to get to know what time it was. $100,000 a year, okay? So specifically, Peter Lötberg, that many of you know who he is, he was really irritated and didn't really know how to handle this because it was so difficult to get the hardware. And then one day, this was around 1990, we all know what happened in the Soviet Union, things were falling apart. People tried to get money in whatever way they could get money. So this is Peter's story, that a gray-haired man stand outside Peter's office in Stockholm and said, "I'm visiting my wife. I work at a factory that makes cesium frequency standards in St. Petersburg. Maybe we should talk." Okay, so here's Peter's story. So what they did was he went to St. Petersburg and he bought this clock, cesium, radioactive, and basically took it at carry-on and was hoping that no one would have a Geiger counter at the airport, and no one did. It cost $5,000 rubles that was paid in cash. How else to do these kind of transactions? And of course, it required armed escort to the bank. So these are the pictures from when this transaction was made. So this is sort of, for all of you who don't really know how it was to sort of run internet when it was illegal to do internet. Well, it was not illegal in Sweden, but it was illegal in Germany. But doing internet around 1990 was kind of interesting. You had to do these kind of things. And in 2004, the clock went poof, but Peter had to repair it. Not very hard, not very easy to sort of understand all the drawings and get all the hardware that was needed. But anyways, it's still working, but the sort of performance is not like clocks that we have today. So this is what Peter's Clock Lab then later looked at. This is a hydrogen maser. Here are a couple of cesium clocks, oscillators. Yeah, what else? Frequency counter. And then, of course, temperature and humidity meter, because it's quite important to have sort of accurate temperature and humidity in these places. So what do we do at Netnode today? We have in Gothenburg, Stockholm, and Malmö. This is what it looks like. We have the connection to Borås. We have the GPS satellite connection. We have 4 rubidium clocks that give 1 PPS and 10 megahertz. We have a switch for the frequency that goes into the 2 NTP servers that then the outside world can talk to over Ethernet. So when you talk NTP, you talk to these that got the pulse from the rubidium clocks. And then you have a lot of control mechanisms to keep track of sort of which one of these clocks are the best. How do you calculate the average of a 1 PPS pulse?
What's in Borås? Is that for Traceable?
In Borås, that is where they are calculating the Swedish official time. And it works like this, that UTC is not UTC without any suffix, is only an average of all the about 40 different UTC versions that exist on the planet. So in Sweden, we use UTC SP for Statens Provningsanstalt. So UTC SP is Swedish time, and that is what they have in Borås. And that is a time that actually do exist on a clock. And that is what we have on our NTP servers, UTC SP. Every month, these 40 labs report what time it is to Paris, to BIPM, which is an organization in Paris. And BIPM calculate, based on last month's calculation, what UTC was a month ago. Okay, so UTC is a desktop product that only exists on paper that they then report back to Borås and say, by the way, your clock, UTC SP, is this much error compared to this sort of fake version. So this average paper version. So when I said that GMT didn't exist, UTC doesn't exist either, okay? But at least UTC exists as an average of the various UTC versions. So what we produce is UTC SP, that is the Swedish time. And Borås, SP in Borås, they have an order from the Swedish government to keep track of that, and also kilo and all these other kind of things, scales and gasoline pumps and whatever. That is what they do in Borås.
Patrik,
yes.
UTC SP then, how much does that differ from the other, neighboring countries?
Well, first of all, Norway and Denmark don't know what time it is. I think they're looking at us. Finland do have a clock, and they are pretty okay. Germany have also a time source, so the difference is really, really, really small, extremely tiny. But we see that with rubidium clocks, yeah, I'll come back to that. So this is the amount of traffic. We get about 2,000 queries per second. So this is the error. This is the precision. I looked at this. This is actually yesterday. This is sorry. I looked yesterday. So this is for Saturday. Okay. So this is the errors of one of the NTP servers Saturday in Stockholm. So if you have really good eyes, you see that we are within 10 to the power minus 6 seconds. That is the precision of the time we have. Now the question is, of course, well, wait a second. If I query that server, what kind of error can I get? What kind of precision will I get? And I will show you some numbers for my own computer at home in a bit, and you will see how bad they are. But one can say that over fiber or Ethernet without any sort of weird transmission like radio links and stuff that I have, you will lose 1 or 2 power, between 1 and 2 powers of 10 for each hop. So if we are 10 to the power minus 6, the best you can get is 10 to the power minus 5 or maybe minus 4. And you understand that that is probably not precise enough for some of the financial institutions. So what we are doing now, to fast forward, we will say on some of the last slides, we are now building a new clock infrastructure together with SP in Borås. So we will be 10 to the power minus 9 in precision, which makes it possible for sort of our customers to be 10 to the power minus 6. Okay? So you lose about 1 power per hop. Yes, John?
So probably, I don't know if this will come up later, but the NTP protocol, how do I actually verify that if I ask ntp1.sp.se, that I actually receive a response from ntp1.sp.se?
Because
not the scary people in between.
Because the NTP protocol nowadays, not our servers, but in the new version, will be signed. So you can validate the signature on those. And yes, we will do IPv6 as well. So today, we're only doing unsigned NTP over IPv4, which, of course, you understand is not good enough. But on the other hand, it has not been easy to find funding, which, Theo, you know how easy it is to find funding for sort of things that everyone wants just to exist, but no one really wants to do. So this is at home. I just took up my box, ordinary hardware Unix box, no virtual server. And I put it up to look at our servers, NTP servers. This was after I've been running for maybe only like 10 minutes, so it's not really synchronized yet. I'm on the other side of a 3.5 kilometer radio link, and like not really nice. So, but if it is the case that you run NTP, I wanted to show you that by doing NTP-Q minus P, you will see a couple of things. And this is sort of the geeky version of things that you can try at home. So it's not very easy to find. The manual pages for NTP is sort of 10,000 times more difficult than the curlman page, for example. So let me explain to you in a couple of slides what you see here. The star means that this is the server that we currently use. The plus sign means that these are the servers that we might use. The minus are the ones that we ignore at the moment. And this changes all the time. So at the moment, we're looking at the one with the star. The 1 means that I am talking directly with the Stratum 1 server. And this means that this server really knows what time it is. If it is the case that you talk to your NTP server or your ISP, the NTP server ISP might be Stratum 2 because it's talked to Stratum 1, and then you will be Stratum 3. So how many hops away from a UTC timescale are we? So this, just because our servers holds a UTC SP, I talk to server with start on 1. So the lower number, the better. The next thing is that how many seconds was it since I last polled these servers? So say 15, 14, 21, 20, etc. What is the poll interval? So every 64 seconds, my machine is going to talk to all of them, try to see what time it is. This is the round trip time in milliseconds, and you see that I live down in Skåne, so the service in Malmö, MMO, are the closest one. They're just 2 milliseconds. Stockholm and Gothenburg, about 16 milliseconds. This is the offset. This is the error. So my server at home is about 1.5 millisecond time difference between my server and that clock. Now, of course, the error here, you see that, oh, wait a second. That means that the difference between these two are like sort of 3 milliseconds. Well, that's not really true. They're much more precise than that. But this is what my server, after being running for 5 minutes, do believe, because it collects a lot of statistics and stuff. So if I check now, it would be sort of much better. But on the other hand, getting 1 millisecond precision and accuracy is pretty OK. And then you have the jitter, which is the difference between 2 samples. What is the difference in milliseconds? So here you show that it has not really understood what time it is on the other end. When it do 2 samples, 64 seconds between them, and you see that the difference is 1.3 milliseconds in what it thinks the time is on the other end, that's an indication that it has a little bit of issue with connectivity, has not been up and running, etc. But NTP is what gives you the information. So NTPQ is a typical good command. If you have log files where you have timestamps, please log the output of NTPQ or equivalent, because this tells you, the offset tells you the error of your timestamps over time. And of course, you have to timestamp the logs of the errors of the timestamps. So the last 10 years in Sweden, it was an investigation launched, an investigation about legal metrology, time and frequency provisioning, a national meteorology center, because time and units is part of meteorology in Sweden. Kind of interesting. So this investigation had a special report on time, traceable time and frequency, and we named it Perfekt Timat, which is kind of fun in Swedish. Anyways, we thought so. And then in 2012, there's a group of agencies in Sweden, the police, the military, PTS, and various others, that write a report now and then. I think they have written 2 reports on what are the highest risk things in the society for the next 5 years. And all the various things that are listed, and the last time the report was issued was in 2012, and this report lists a couple of issues, and then you have these agencies say, I'll take care of this, I'll take care of that, etc. And one of the things they pointed out was the increased dependency of time and the lack of Swedish time being available in Sweden, time and frequency. So the regulator PTS then said, wait a second, we can take care of this. And then since 2012, they have been working on trying to get budget for this. And in 2014, they managed to get money. And they gave the money to me. So what has happened all the time then is that SP and Borås keeping track of time. They are very academic. We are operational. So we are the ones that now are required by the regulator to provide NTP, IEEE 1588 version 2, both time and frequency for free for anyone in Sweden as a public service. And this is what actually the agreement says. For those of you who work with time, this is what we're going to deliver no later than December 15 this year.
Will you be in time?
I hope so. So no, it looks good actually. Our first clock was actually up and running in the lab 1 month earlier than what we planned. It was up and running mid-April instead of mid-May. So we are ahead of time actually. But we are going to, as you see, John, you asked this question, we are actually going to respond IPv4, IPv6, 10 gigabits per second with signed NTP. So unfortunately, you cannot really buy those Ethernet cards. So we are developing our own Ethernet cards, and that's what takes a little bit of time now. 1 gig is not so hard because Intel nowadays, which is kind of cool, we were looking at those cards, but it's only 1 gig. You can now buy standard Intel cards, Ethernet cards, where you can have an external frequency. So if you have a cesium clock, you can take the frequency for the Ethernet card from the external source instead of the CPU. And that means that the clock on the Ethernet card will go very, very precise because it takes the tick from the cesium clock. And we were actually the ones that told Intel, no, we don't want a solder on an Ethernet card. You better have these standard connectors. So they actually changed the design so you connect and then what you do is that when you want to send an IP packet, before you load the IP packet on the Ethernet card, and by the way, Intel has developed drivers for this for Linux. So this is actually kind of cool. So you don't have to write the actual hardware drivers. When you put the Ethernet packet or the IP packet on the card, you have a timestamp on the packet itself. And the card then builds a queue in its memory and will only send the packet when the clock in the card says, now it's time to send it. So what you can do if you want to have a cool NTP server is that you calculate the time in the future that you want to send the packet with. And then you put the packet on the memory in the queue of the Ethernet card with the timestamp in the future. And then when the time is right, the card will just send it for you. And that will make the timestamping of Ethernet packet or IP packets really, really good, specifically have an external time source. On the other hand, the card is not reordering the packet. So you need to sort of know that in what order it's sort of first come. It's an ordinary FIFO queue. But anyways, it's actually kind of cool. And that's an ordinary like $50 Ethernet card, 1 gig. Really, really cool. But we have to do this in 10 gig. So unfortunately, we actually have to be able to respond with NTP and sign NTP in the card itself without using the CPU in the computer. So that's what we are currently developing. So that's kind of cool. It's actually kind of some things to do as well, some real hacking. OK, but if we cannot use the common view, how do we transfer time from Stockholm to Malmö if we cannot use the satellite? Well, this is something they figure out in Borås together with some people in Gothenburg. And that is that if it is the case that you have an SDH signal in fiber, you have in SDH, you have every 125 milliseconds, you have a pulse coming, a pulse that is 25 nanoseconds long. And the time between these pulses is actually very, very precise. The fiber compared to copper is not changing much depending on temperature or anything, which means that if we just know the propagation time between Stockholm and Malmö, it will always be the same. So by just having a fiber splitter, which is basically the same thing as FRA and others are using, so by just using one of those in each end and removing about 2 dB of power, 1.5 dB of light, we can peak on the flanks of the SDH signal and that way calculate and that way sort of move the tick between 2 locations. Really cool. So this is the paper that was written. You can look at that if you want to. Swedish innovation. And with the help of this and this card that we are now developing, this new architecture means that an NTP server will be able to, if you look at the normal distribution, you will see about 7.5 nanosecond instead is the distribution of the responses from that kind of sort of timestamp IP packets going out of a server. So this is what we are looking forward to, which is really cool. So that's it. This is ordinary Symmetricom cesium clock. This is one of the first one I got into my office. Not connected to anything, but I just had it there, and it was so. I just wanted to have it. So this was our first cesium clock. There. So if you want to read a little bit more of this, you actually have a couple of really cool things, from sundials to atomic clocks. This paper from NIST is really cool. Then you have a book on longitude. The first guy that actually tried to move time across the Atlantic, because you could know the time when you know what latitude you were on, but not the longitude without having a precise clock. And then this really, really good book on electronic signing where I sort of wrote part of it. Anyways, really good. With that, thank you.
Okay, holy shit. So I think what I learned today is that you can be wrong as long as you're consistently wrong, right?
I said that I'm not always right, but almost 100% never wrong. Anyways.
Right. So for people who sort of need to take off, you're more than free to leave now, right?
Oh,
You're good now.
absolutely.
You can go.
Yeah.
But I thought, I mean, for as long as you're sort of free and willing to stay to have an open question / discussion thing, and then we could sort of move on to the kitchen and then talk more. So thank you for coming and fire away.
Oh, you're going to run with the microphone? Or, yeah, why not?
Who decides when to insert leap seconds?
That is the BIPM in Paris.
Do they care if or rather, can you if they decide we're gonna put it on midsummer and all the Swedish operators go no please put the leap second somewhere else?
That it's actually they have agreed to only add it one of two places, last of December or last of June. It cannot be random. Okay. And they report it. I think they reported like 6 months in advance. On the other hand, there is a discussion in ITU whether we should stop adding leap seconds. And that actually creates kind of interesting thing because, like, for me, it's more like a religious discussion. Like, are we going to stop having time based on Earth rotation around the sun? So what I'm telling these, of course, the Swedish government has asked me a serious question. What should Sweden vote? Because this is voting. And this is one of the few issues where I actually have not been able to advise the Swedish government on what to vote on. As Theo knows, I sort of have say no, yes, no, that's okay. But this one, I don't know what the right thing is. So the problem, of course, is that what I say back is that people say there is a problem with leap seconds in computers. Yes, it is. Google has said that. Yes, I know. There are a lot of software that cannot handle that you have 60 seconds. But I claim we have more problems when you switch to and from daylight savings in computer systems. So I think that is the first thing to remove. Excuse me? Oh, hell yes. It's so bloody wrong. Anyways, so unfortunately, so in Paris they decided it can be either added or not. We know 6 months in advance, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. It might be a stupid question, but why can't we have like a not maybe constant, but like agreed upon kind of galactic time, and then have like gradients of different micro nanoseconds spread over like coordinates in the like solar system or Earth for that matter.
Yeah.
Instead of like having time zones in chunks that change like that.
We could do that. Well, I think you're asking two different things here, and I sort of agree with both. So the first thing, let's try to. So first of all, we have this. And one thing we agreed to is that we have this TA1, which started in sort of 1st of January 1958, with no difference from the blue line, which is sort of the Earth rotation. So the first thing we have is the blue TAI, which is a stable time. The length of each second according to TA1 is exactly the same. It's based on the cesium atom, okay? So for a lot of calculation in astronomy, they use TA1. They don't use UTC. So that solves one of the problems. The other problems has to do with sort of the time zones we have on Earth extrapolated to the rest of the world. And that is something that, like, people in astronomy, sort of, you should talk to them more, because I don't really know how they do it, to be honest. But I do know that in many cases you use TAI just because of this reason. So the important thing, also, if you use UTC SP or whatever it is, whenever you have a timestamp, you need to know what time scale it is, not only the time zone. So as long as you know which one of these it is, it is possible to calculate what time it is. The problem, though, and one of the issues with leap seconds, is that just because we don't know when leap seconds will be added, we cannot say what time, according to UTC, it will be 3 years from now, because we don't know how many leap seconds will be added. So we know
Can that
historically,
be-
but not in the future.
You said something about like the Earth's magnetic.
Yes, the pole is rotating.
Don't we have like working physical models for that?
Yes, and
Which
that's the
could
difference.
compensate.
Yes, and that's why we know that we, even though leap seconds can be both added and removed, around since 1650, the Earth has started to rotate slower. So it was an interval about 150 years that if we had leap seconds, we would have removed seconds. So we had only 59 seconds per minute. But now we are in a situation where the Earth is slowing down for various reasons. And that will probably continue for a couple of 100 years, according to those models.
Okay. And I also had another question. I'm noticing that like in the Internet of Things stuff and like making people and events more connected, we're running into issue of speed of light. That light itself is like making problems. Do you think that we have to have like maybe like every 299 kilometers like stations routing over the planet, or are we like doing something quantum mechanically to
what we do have so good physical models, at least so far, and the problem we have had has to do with fibers that go north-south on the planet, because the Earth rotates around its own axis, things that are closer to the equator actually moves faster through space than things that are further north or further south. And that means that just because they move different, the time is actually different. The length of a second, because of relativity, they actually is different. The length of a second is different in the two locations. Okay, and that means that when we have higher frequency through the fiber, you have to take the relativity theory into account when you calculate, when you clock the light in the fiber. So you have a higher problem with frequency because of relativity more than time itself. But because of frequency, yes, nowadays you have to take relativity theory into account, specifically when things move through space in different speed. And yes, it is enough to look at two different locations on the planet.
And also, do you have any comments on like a kind of like standardized system for the whole solar system? Because I'm imagining that with the increasing number of satellites around different planets and their moons, we're gonna have some issue with that. Is there any research?
Could be. I don't know.
Thanks.
Sorry. But what I do know is that a lot of these satellites, anyways, they do have radioactive sort of for creating energy, anyways, and they sort of use the same kind of thing also. So you have literally an atomic clock in each one of the satellites, and just because a satellite has a limited lifetime, you know what the clock is on that satellite, and you can compensate for it. So once again, for each clock you have, if you know what accuracy it has, you know what tick it is, you know what it is, blah, blah, then you can always recalculate the counters of that specific clock to whatever counter you have yourself. The problem is, of course, to move the time. So if the satellite tells you the time is now this, it takes a certain amount of time for the signal to reach you, and then you need to compensate for that, etc. So that's difficult. Specifically, if the satellite then is moving away from you or towards you, that creates also sort of a frequency shift in the radio signal as well. But that you can also use to know how far away the speed of the satellite, of course. Yeah.
Hi. Well, you mentioned GPS several times.
Yep.
Today we also have like GLONASS, and I don't remember the name of the Chinese version.
Baidu.
What's your take on those systems for timekeeping?
And then you have Galileo in Europe.
Yeah, sure.
They are exactly the same. So you have the same kind of issue, and the build system we are building now is able to handle all of them. I think it was a mistake in Europe to build Galileo. So the argument for Galileo was that it was supposed to be a copycat of GPS, just not controlled by the US. Okay. The problem with that is that if it is the case to jam or destroy GPS, you also destroy Galileo. And they have the same kind of errors, the same kind of propagation errors regarding radio. So I think it would have been much better for Europe to use either the Chinese or the Russian system or one system of their own, because that would have been a complement to the GPS. Nowadays, if you have a GPS receiver, having a Galileo receiver as well doesn't give you so much extra. Okay. But all of those systems they sort of have, because they are slightly different in design. I think it's a little bit unfortunate that GPS and Galileo, that probably will be the two more dominant system in the world, are so similar because they have the same errors.
So precision-wise, you don't think it really matters?
No.
Thanks.
During one part of your presentation, you talked about law.
Yep.
And you said there is sometimes you need to prove there's like a specific time for that time to occur.
Yep.
How often do you need to calibrate, or how often do you need to prove that you calibrated the watch?
Well, it's as in Sweden. In Sweden, it's kind of easy because the legislation system in Sweden means that anyone can provide any kind of evidence to the court, and then it's up to the court to decide.
Okay.
So in Sweden, according to our legal system, not being a lawyer, it's actually we don't have to be precise. Okay. That is also, on the other hand, that is why you have recommendations from, for example, law enforcement and the regulator that tells you how you are supposed to do things, and then the court can take that into account. For time, how often you do that, I have not seen any recommendations because there are not enough people that have been dealing with this. One company I've been working with quite a lot regarding time stamping is the online signing system Scribe. That is, as you might heard about, that you can sign things online, where we did rebuild their time stamping into using UTC SP towards our clock. So if you sign something with Scribe and you look at the signed portion of the PDF, that is sort of hidden area, you will see output from NTPQ for 500 samples every 5 seconds back in time. So it's actually part of the signed document, the actual error itself. I think that is exaggerating, but on the other hand, like, we have the space, so why not? Personally, I think that if you have an ordinary computer that is, okay, let me take a step back. If you run a virtual server, I would take samples more often. So I think you can look at your own clock, how often you should do it. If you have a hardware clock, no problem at all. But what I can tell you is that Amazon, that I've been discussing this with, together with Scribe, that use Amazon virtual servers, they are not promising the clock of the virtual hosts or any precision whatsoever, except at the time of boot. So if you're running something on Amazon virtual servers, you should actually run NTP on the virtual servers.
Thank you.
Now, I don't think that Amazon, the virtual servers, they don't seem to go to have lots of errors compared to other virtual servers. But if you talk to Amazon, they are not prepared of standing up in court and proving that the clock on the guest machine is correct. Maybe people want to go out there.
Seems like a good time to go out in the kitchen and have a couple of drinks and talk more. Sir?
Sure.
I crawl in your dust. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.